Moulton Howe is an Emmy Award-winning investigative journalist who has spent 25 years collecting testimonies from military personnel, scientists, government contractors, and intelligence officers about what exists beneath the Antarctic ice. She did not rush to publish. She verified. She waited. She kept the accounts private until the witnesses started dying. What she found across those 25 years is something she can no longer keep quiet. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because what is under that ice changes everything. Moulton Howe did not arrive at the Antarctica investigation through the paranormal research community, whose credibility the institutional scientific world declines to extend. She arrived through journalism, through the specific discipline of investigative reporting, whose standards of source verification, factual corroboration, and evidence documentation gave her work a foundation whose rigor the dismissal that the paranormal research community's output typically receives could not be straightforwardly applied to. Her Emmy Award is not a credential she acquired through the paranormal investigation field. It is a credential she brought to it from a professional journalism career whose standards shaped everything she subsequently applied to the subjects that mainstream investigative journalism had declined to seriously engage with. That professional foundation is what distinguishes her Antarctica investigation from the broader field of Antarctica conspiracy research, whose output the institutional scientific community dismisses without engagement. She did not collect rumors. She did not aggregate internet speculation. She conducted interviews with specific individuals whose institutional backgrounds and whose professional records she verified before treating their accounts as evidentially significant. She checked service records. She confirmed operational histories. She cross-referenced the specific details, the locations, the dates, the unit designations, the operational names that the independent accounts provided against the verifiable portions of the documentary record before concluding that what the accounts described was consistent with events that had actually occurred. The investigation she built across 25 years is the most extensively documented first-person testimony record on the subject of Antarctica's anomalous underground environment that exists in any public or private archive. It contains accounts from people who were physically present at locations beneath the Antarctic ice whose existence the public record does not acknowledge. It contains coordinates, operational designations, and physical descriptions whose consistency across independent sources separated by years and institutional distance is not the consistency of coordinated fabrication. It is the consistency of people who were in the same places and saw the same things and spent years deciding whether to say so. What they said, and what Moulton Howe did with what they said across 25 years of careful, methodical, verification-oriented investigation, is what this video documents in full. The investigation that became 25 years of accumulated Antarctica testimony began with a single man whose account Moulton Howe received in 1998, and whose verification she completed before she allowed herself to consider what it meant. He was a United States Navy flight engineer who had participated in what was documented as a routine supply mission in 1982, a flight from McMurdo Station toward a remote research camp deep in the Antarctic interior, whose operational parameters were standard, and whose crew had no expectation that the session would produce anything beyond the logistical completion of a scheduled supply delivery. An equipment problem forced an unplanned landing on a ridge. The crew focused on the mechanical issue. The flight engineer looked out across the terrain and noticed something in the distance that the natural landscape of the Antarctic ice field did not produce. Clean lines, sharp angles, perfect symmetry, the specific geometry of intentional construction rather than the irregular, random geometry of geological formation or ice accumulation. He moved closer. What he found was part of a massive structure whose exposure, where wind had removed layers of ice across the years since its construction, revealed surfaces that were not rock and not ice, surfaces that had been shaped. He was called back before he could investigate further. When the crew landed, intelligence officers were waiting. The crew was separated and questioned individually. Flight logs were classified, non-disclosure agreements were signed, and a single instruction was given whose simplicity communicated everything about the institutional weight behind it. This never happened. The flight engineer honored the agreement for 16 years. In 1998, approaching his 70s and having lived with the account across the full span of that silence, he made the decision that many people make when the end of their ability to speak approaches, the decision that what he had seen was more important than the agreement he had made about not saying so. He reached out to Moulton Howe. She listened carefully. She recorded every detail. She verified his service record and confirmed his background against the operational history of the units he described. Everything matched. She placed his testimony in her files and waited, not because she doubted what he had told her, but because she understood that one witness, however credible, was not sufficient foundation for the claim his account required the world to take seriously. She did not have to wait long for the next one. After the flight engineer's account in 1998, Linda Moulton Howe did not publicize what she had received. She continued her investigative journalism work, and she waited. What she did not anticipate was how quickly the waiting would produce results. How rapidly the specific combination of her established reputation for careful, respectful handling of sensitive testimony and the apparent readiness of a community of people who had been carrying significant accounts in silence would generate a stream of independent contacts whose consistency would eventually transform a single compelling testimony into the most significant pattern of corroborated witness accounts on any single subject she had ever encountered in her investigative career. Over the next 20 years, more people contacted her. They came from different institutional backgrounds, different time periods, and different geographic locations within the Antarctic operational theater. None of them knew each other. None of them had shared their accounts before. A geophysicist who had worked on ice-penetrating radar surveys described seeing unusual readings beneath the Antarctic surface during a mission, large, organized empty spaces at significant depth whose geometric regularity was inconsistent with natural cave formation. When he reported the data to his supervisor, the supervisor went silent, ordered the data classified, and had the entire team reassigned before the end of the day. A member of a Navy construction battalion described a mission whose briefing consisted of a single instruction: drill straight down. When the shaft reached its target depth, he saw walls that were metallic and smooth, too regular, too perfect. Built. A scientist from Argentina's Esperanza base described team members pulling objects from ice cores whose age exceeded 12,000 years and whose physical characteristics were not consistent with natural geological material. Every time an unusual object was recovered, military personnel arrived within hours and removed the samples without leaving any record of their visit. A pilot described a restricted zone in the Antarctic airspace that did not appear on any official map, a zone whose existence he discovered when he flew toward it and was redirected, and whose nature a superior officer summarized in 4 words before telling him to stop asking. Sensitive research. Stop asking. The accounts accumulated. Linda laid them side by side and studied the connections. Different people, different years, different locations within the operational geography of the Antarctic program. The same pattern, something large, structured, and hidden, existed beneath the Antarctic ice. And the institutions that knew about it had been maintaining that knowledge in silence across a span of time that the oldest accounts, which connected to Operation High Jump in 1946, established as extending across more than 70 years of documented concealment. In 2016, 18 years after the flight engineer's initial account had begun the investigation, Linda Moulton Howe received a communication from a source whose institutional background and whose specific knowledge of the Antarctica operation placed him in a different category from every prior witness she had spoken with. He was a retired NORAD officer with classified clearance whose involvement in an Antarctic operation in the early 2000s had given him direct access to information about the nature and the scale of what the program had been studying beneath the ice. Linda subsequently described him as the most credible source she had ever interviewed in her career, a characterization whose weight her professional history of engaging with sensitive testimony from institutional insiders gives the full measure of. What the NORAD officer told her changed the scale of everything the prior accounts had established. He confirmed the existence of structures beneath the West Antarctic ice sheet at a depth of approximately 2 miles, whose character was not consistent with any natural formation. These were not rocks. They were not ice formations shaped by geological process. They were built forms, shaped with precision and clear design, whose character the instrument data he had accessed during his operational involvement described as representing intentional construction rather than natural accumulation. The detail that changed everything else was the age. The structures were older than the ice above them. They existed before the last ice age, before the period approximately 12,000 years ago when the Antarctic climate was fundamentally different from what it has been across the entirety of recorded human history. 12,000 years ago, Antarctica was not the frozen continent the modern world knows. It was a temperate land with rivers, forests, and an environment capable of supporting complex life. Whatever built the structures beneath the ice did so in a pre-glacial Antarctica, whose existence predates every human civilization, whose archaeological record the academic world has established. The officer described the history of the institutional awareness of these structures, their initial detection during Operation High Jump in 1946, the classification of the seismic survey data that first identified them, and the 70-year history of recovery operations that the United States, Russia, and later China had conducted at the sites without any public acknowledgement of what those operations were recovering. The scale he described exceeded everything the prior accounts had established, not isolated structures, an extended complex, something whose architecture suggested a city, and some of what the recovery operations had removed from that complex still worked. The researchers who studied the recovered objects could not determine how they functioned anyway. The question of how recovery teams physically accessed the structures 2 miles beneath the Antarctic ice was answered for Linda Moulton Howe through the account of a military contractor who had worked on a classified drilling operation in 2003. His account provided the operational detail of what accessing the underground structures actually required and what the people who descended into the shafts encountered when they reached the structure's interior. The drilling operation he participated in was not described to the crew in terms that reflected its actual purpose. They were told they were accessing a geological anomaly. The cover description was standard, the kind of explanation that classified operations use to provide participants with a functional rationale that is true in its most literal sense while completely misrepresenting the nature of what is being accessed. The shaft descended through the Antarctic ice in the conditions that anyone who has considered what 2 miles of ice looks like from the inside can imagine. The walls blue-white with the compressed ice of millennia, the light from the surface diminishing as the descent progressed until it was a small circle above and then nothing. Darkness, equipment lighting only, and then, at the bottom of the shaft, the ice stopped, not gradually, in the way that a natural transition between geological materials produces a gradual change in the visual environment of a shaft. Suddenly, the ice ended and the open space beyond it began. The contractor stepped off the platform at the bottom of the shaft into a space that was large, open, and clearly not natural. The walls carried markings, symbols whose pattern and whose distribution across the wall surface indicated intentional placement rather than natural geological marking, and whose content matched no known writing system from any human civilization in any academic reference he or anyone in the team could access. And there was a doorway, a passage leading deeper into the interior of the complex beyond the shaft's terminus, an opening whose existence communicated something specific about the scale of what was on the other side of it. The contractor did not have clearance to enter. He watched as scientists and military personnel with higher clearance prepared to pass through the doorway into the interior. Before his involvement concluded, he said something to Linda, whose specific content she has preserved as one of the most significant statements any of her Antarctica witnesses produced. "People should know that we found something down there that changes history." He was ill when he spoke to her. He was not certain how much time he had. He had decided that the account was more important than the agreement he had signed. And what was on the other side of the doorway, what the high-clearance personnel entered, and what the recovery operations have been removing from the interior of the Antarctic complex across the decades since its initial access, is the question that the following sections of this video address. The specific question of what the Antarctic recovery operations have been extracting from the underground structures across the decades of their operation, and what has happened to the recovered material in the classified facility network that receives it, is the dimension of the Antarctica cover-up, whose public evidence is most fragmentary and whose witness testimony is most carefully worded. The people who have knowledge of the recovery program's outputs are the people whose institutional proximity to the classified facilities that receive recovered material is closest: the analysts, the material scientists, and the logistics coordinators whose professional involvement in the program gave them direct knowledge of specific recovered items without giving them the complete picture of the program's full scope. A material scientist who briefly studied samples taken from Antarctic recovery operations told Linda that the materials he examined did not match anything in any known database. Not close matches whose specific variations from known materials could be attributed to unusual natural formation conditions. No match. The elemental composition, the structural properties, and the physical characteristics of what he examined were outside the reference framework of the complete materials science knowledge base he had access to through his institutional affiliation. A satellite imagery analyst described seeing unusual shapes in Antarctic satellite images before they were processed for public release, and watching those shapes be blurred or removed from the images before they left the processing system. The cleaning of the satellite data was systematic and professional. Someone who understood exactly what the images contained was making decisions about what the public version of those images would show. A logistics coordinator who worked with the NSF Antarctic program described equipment lists for specific operations whose contents did not match any normal scientific research mission. Heavy excavation tools, sealed transport containers, and supply chain routing that connected through Department of Defense infrastructure rather than through the civilian research program's standard logistics network. The pattern that these accounts establish about the recovery program is consistent with an operation that has been extracting physical material from underground structures of non-human origin across a period of decades, and routing that material through classified facility networks for study whose results have not entered any public scientific literature. What the recovered objects that still function, the devices that the NORAD officer described as operational despite the inability of the researchers studying them to determine their operating principles, have produced in terms of the classified research programs whose existence their presence implies, is the question that the public record contains no answer to. The silence on that question is the most consequential element of everything the Antarctica cover-up contains. The historical depth of the Antarctica cover-up, the specific timeline of institutional awareness that the NORAD officers account, and the other witness testimonies establish, is the dimension of the investigation whose implications for the public's understanding of what governments have known and concealed across the span of modern history are most significant. Operation High Jump, conducted by Admiral Richard Byrd between 1946 and 1947, is the documented beginning of the institutional awareness that the cover-up has been maintaining. The official account of Operation High Jump describes a large-scale naval operation whose stated purposes involved training exercises, establishing research stations, and conducting photographic surveys of the Antarctic coastline. The classified dimension of what the operation found, the seismic survey data that detected unusual signals beneath the ice whose characteristics did not match any known geological structure, is not in the official record. It is in the accounts of the sources whose institutional proximity to the program's classified outputs gave them access to what the official record was specifically designed not to contain. The signals Operation High Jump detected were documented, the documentation was classified, and the 70-year history of continuing operations at the locations the initial detection identified, the recovery missions, the drilling operations, the satellite imagery management, and the restricted airspace maintenance whose combined operational scope has required the sustained institutional coordination of multiple governments across multiple decades, began with the decision to classify those initial seismic readings rather than to share them with the scientific community or the public. What that decision has cost, in terms of the scientific knowledge that might have been developed from open study of what the Antarctic structures contain, and in terms of the public's ability to understand the true history of intelligent life's presence on this planet, is a calculation whose full accounting the cover-up has made impossible to complete. The governments that have been running recovery operations in Antarctica for 70 years have had access to physical artifacts whose age, whose material composition, and whose functional status the witness accounts collectively establish as representing evidence of a civilization whose existence predates every human civilization whose history the academic world has been teaching. They have kept that access private across the full span of a period that encompasses the entirety of the modern world's development, and the silence with which they have responded to every public attempt to establish the truth of what is under that ice is the most consistent and the most revealing thing about everything the investigation has established. By 2020, Linda Moulton Howe had assembled more than 15 credible testimonies from witnesses whose institutional backgrounds, whose service records, and whose accounts she had verified across the 22-year span of the investigation's development. The testimony record she had built was the most extensively documented first-person account collection on the Antarctica underground structures that existed in any public or private archive. And then the witnesses started dying. The retired NORAD officer, the source she had described as the most credible she had ever interviewed, the man whose account had changed the scale of everything the investigation had established, died in 2022. His death followed the deaths of other witnesses whose accounts had formed the evidentiary foundation of the investigation across its development. Not all at once. Not in circumstances whose specific timing produced the pattern of suspicious deaths that some investigations into sensitive government programs have generated, but consistently enough, across a period short enough, that Linda found herself in the specific and consequential position of being the last person who held all of the accounts together, the only remaining custodian of a testimony record whose individual contributors were no longer able to speak for themselves. That realization changed her calculation about the investigation's public communication in a way that no prior development across 22 years had changed it. She had been waiting for more evidence. She had been waiting for the corroboration whose accumulation would make the complete account impossible to dismiss. She had been maintaining the silence of a journalist who understood that the weight of what she was carrying required the most defensible possible foundation before it could be responsibly released. The deaths of her witnesses changed the weight of the other side of that calculation, the cost of continued waiting, whose most significant consequence was no longer the inadequacy of the account's evidentiary foundation, but the permanent loss of the account itself. In a 2023 interview, she described the moment whose specific character the deaths of her witnesses had produced in her. She had a responsibility to the men who had trusted her. Their testimonies needed to survive them, and the only way to ensure that survival was to release what she had been protecting, to put the complete account into the public domain in a form whose existence was no longer dependent on the continued survival of the people whose testimony had created it. In early 2024, Linda Moulton Howe released portions of her comprehensive Antarctica report through earthfiles.com, coordinates where witnesses reported structures, declassified Operation High Jump documents from 1946 with redacted sections, 25 years of verified testimony from military personnel, scientists, contractors, and intelligence officers who were physically present at locations the public record does not acknowledge. The government response was what the investigation's prior history had prepared her for. No denials, no confirmations, no explanations, only silence. Linda has said the silence means something specific, that institutions with nothing to hide say so. Institutions with satisfying conventional explanations provide them. The absence of both is the behavior of institutions that have calculated silence is less costly than any available response. The witnesses who trusted her are almost all gone. The account survives. Whatever is under the Antarctic ice has been known to multiple governments across the entirety of the modern world's development. The silence that greets the evidence is the answer that confirms everything the evidence contains.